Hello, and as that theme music fades away, I want to welcome you to episode 2 of Shaman Warrior. I'm Paul Andrews, I'm the host, long-term researcher, practitioner of shamanic technique and the martial arts. That's what this podcast is all about. It's about that intersection of esoteric, spiritual, whatever you want to call that kind of stuff, with martial arts. And we're going to look into that specifically from the point of view of what we call shamanism. And in order to get on the same page, this episode is going to be all about what is shamanism. I should warn you now that this is my fourth or fifth attempt at trying to record this. My last attempt was really long. It was almost an hour and a half long. And I want to do something shorter. My other attempts, I think, they just weren't up to scratch with what I wanted to go into. The problem with discussing shamanism, of course, is that it's a huge subject. You can go down all kinds of rabbit holes and off on tangents and get off topic very quickly by looking at specifics. So this is going to be very much a whistle-stop tour of shamanism, what shamanism is, and then that puts us on the same page so that as we move forward, we can start to understand shamanism within the martial arts or shamanic technique within the martial arts from the same place. So I'm not going to cover everything that shamanism involves, but it's going to be a nice introduction for people who maybe have some misconceptions about what shamanism is. So we're going to go into a little bit history and the different kinds of areas of the world where shamanism is found, what shamanism involves, is it a religion or not? We're going to look a little bit about civilization and how shamanism fits in with civilization, and then we'll have a look at something that we call, well, that's going to feed into something that we call the miasma, a term that we use to describe a certain thing, and eventually we're going to get on and we're just going to touch upon something that we call chalicity, and then we'll leave it there. In the next episode we'll probably focus a little bit more on that word chalicity and what it really entails. Before I get going, I'm going to point you towards a few resources. A resource for the more hardcore people or academically focused kind of people would be Mircea Eliade's book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And this book, although it's quite old now, and some of Eliade's assumptions and the wording in there might be a little bit outdated now. It's still a great book to give you an overview of the kind of I was going to say the superficial aspects of shamanism, things like what rituals do certain shamans in certain places do, what clothing do they wear, and so on. It goes into a lot of detail about all of that stuff, but it also is really good at giving you a feeling for what real shamanism really involves, and what it did involve in the past, because a lot of this has been lost now. So that's one resource to look at. The other resource, I think I mentioned this previously, is that my long-time martial arts teacher and shamanic guide, Damon Smith, along with my good friend Joseph Sikora, they have a podcast called the Woven Energy Podcast on practical shamanism. A lot of their early episodes will overlap with some of the stuff that I'm saying today, and it also gives you exercises and techniques to get involved in pure shamanism. So most of that stuff isn't going to have any specific context into the martial arts, but it's a great resource to get going and start to understand what practical shamanism is all about. Okay, let's start at the beginning of the universe. We have the Big Bang. For those of you who may not believe in the Big Bang, just have a look around at the evidence. Go and see things that have been put out there by NASA and other space agencies. These really big telescopes, the space telescopes that we've got, the Hubble, the James Webb, and so on, they can actually see back into time. And this is because light takes time to move over distance. If it's coming from far enough away, we know that it has taken millions or billions of years to get to us, and that means that light is coming from a time which was relatively shortly after the Big Bang. So there is evidence, we can see it, we can see the effects of what the Big Bang did. So if you think about this, the Big Bang, everything in the universe was all at one point a singularity, and then something happened. We don't really need to understand why or what happened, but it started to expand. Changes started to happen. So that means there must have been an original change. So something changed, and then from that change, energy and movement started to happen, and matter started to coalesce. So we've got energy and we've got matter and energy, structure and energy, and they start to interact. And every time that they interact, you can either release energy or store energy as matter. Things can come together, things can split apart, things can change character due to those interactions. And over time, those changes start to echo. So one change could then create another, that creates another, and it goes all the way to us. So we are the result, this time, this place, this universe are the result of all the changes that have happened right back to the start. And within those changes, there can be patterns. Sometimes we see patterns. They can be very obvious. Quite often you can see spiral shapes within nature. You can see them in the movement of water. You can see them in arrangements of seeds in flower heads. You can see them in the shape of galaxies. So you've got spirals, very obvious. So those patterns are there. Sometimes you get linear patterns, sometimes you get circular patterns, sometimes you get spiral patterns, sometimes you get other types of patterns that form within nature, within the universe. And we are kind of a pattern-seeking species. We understand things in patterns, or we can do. And in a way, shamanism and shamanic technique allows you to get into a state of mind that helps you to pick up on those patterns and pick up on information that may at first not be obvious within the environment and within nature. So all of that understanding that everything at one point was all together means that everything is still connected through energy, connected through that shared history of at one point, even though it may be a long, long time in the past, we all came from the same place. So we are all the same thing. And that understanding is really the basis of what's called animism. So if you're an animist, you believe that everything's connected. And in fact, I'm going to change that statement. If you're an animist, you understand that everything is connected. That word belief, we're going to get into problems with language as we go along, but belief is riddled with cultural baggage. Specifically, in Western societies, we are heavily, heavily influenced by our history of the Abrahamic religions influencing our culture, particularly within Europe and America. In the Americas, Christianity has really affected our culture, but also the other Abrahamic traditions, Islam and Judaism, have similar kind of cultural understandings of certain things. So belief, it's almost taken that you must believe something or you must have faith. So blind faith, blind belief, it is not something that's really present within animism and shamanism. Direct experience gives understanding. So animists, because they're usually so in tune with nature, in tune with their surroundings, just by living in nature, they understand that connection. They understand their place within nature. They understand the place of animals and plants and different processes within the environment, within nature. They understand it. They don't believe in it because it's there. They can see it. They know it's there. That intimate experience gives them that understanding. So that's a really good point, is that shamanism isn't based on belief. So if anyone says, shamans believing spirits or believe in this or believe in that, that's not really true. Real shamanism is based upon experience. So why am I talking about animism? Animism is that baseline understanding that everything's connected together and that you want to live in harmony, in connection with your environment. And within that realm of animism, you're going to have people who are, you could be called shamans. And the shamans are those people who are a little bit more curious, who, rather than just understanding that they have a place within nature and that's connected together, they want to understand how things are connected together and why they're connected together, and what if we did something here, how would that connection create changes, just as the changes from the Big Bang onwards have echoed along. Shamans want to see what changes may impact or how they affect their environment and them and the people around them. And why are shamans, why do they exist? Why don't we all just live as animists? Or why did we not all just live as animists? And this comes back to kind of evolution and survival, is that the shaman really was, when we were evolving into humans, and this could go back millions of years now, because for a very long period of our history, our ancestors may not be Homo sapiens, but it could be the species that we evolved from as well, because they are still us. We've just changed into a slightly different form of us. But those people live for millions of years in their environment before becoming civilized, before settling down, before building cities and towns and undertaking agriculture and so on. And living in that environment, there are obviously dangers to it. And we can see those things. Even today, there are some tribes of hunter-gathering people or nomadic pastoral people who still have strong connections to their environment, natural environments, that haven't been particularly changed too much. And those people still have a strong connection to shamanism. And the reason being is that within those groups, there will be people who naturally have a greater affinity and connection to nature, and there will be people who are curious, and there will be people who want to help their group to a greater extent. And that is one of the aspects of the shaman. The shaman is usually that person that helps the group. They're often usually seen as a bit of an oddball, someone who does strange things, because they're trying to work things out. They're trying to see, what if this happened? what if I do this? What if I do that? And sometimes those things work and sometimes they don't. But through their understanding and intimacy with nature and through their experience with nature, they develop this really strong connection. This very strong connection with nature allows them to pull out information that can be useful. So you can imagine that if you're in a hunter-gatherer tribe and you're out in the wilderness somewhere, there are lots of things that you've got to kind of be wary of or understand, and those things could have a direct impact on your survival. So it could be like where to find water, when to move, if you're nomadic, when to move according to the animals that maybe you're hunting, how to track and follow them as they migrate. If you're a pastoralist, then it could be that when to move your animals, your domesticated animals, to better feeding grounds. It might be that you take them up the mountains, but in winter you got to take them back down again. And if you don't go down at the right time, you're going to get snowed in. So all these things, they can affect survival. They can mean the difference between going hungry and getting fed. And the shaman would provide advice on these things. The shaman would also traditionally take on other roles like healing. So they would have a greater understanding than most of the other people in the tribe of plants and animals and what effects those things could have on the human body. They would also probably have done a lot of work experimenting with their own body and their own movement and get experience with the people around them. So understanding of the human body was probably a little bit different. It's not going to be like modern medicine, but they would be a healer within the group as well, most likely. Or they could have been a healer or have some capacity in that state. And generally just providing advice. Now, the ironic thing is that because shamans are these people who do these experiments and learn these different things, they were also probably the people that came up with the ideas that led to civilization. So they were probably the people that found out that if you grow certain types of grains, you can make them bigger or get more yield out of them. And then that would mean, well, let's stay around here where these grains grow. And then they would improve the way that those grains grow. And then, they would learn how to create flour from them and biscuits and breads and so on. They're probably the people that instigated a lot of that. Once you start to get that agricultural surplus, you got more food than you need. You don't need to go running around hunting your food. You're going to start to settle down where that production is. And if you've got somewhere with a stable environment, then that means you can settle down in one place. You can build houses, you can build walls, and these houses and walls start to protect you from aspects of the environment that you would have had to be more wary of previously, like predators that might come and get you. And these things start to build up into civilization. You can support more people, so the groups get bigger. Now, shamanism really works best in small groups. In an average sized tribe, a hunter-gatherer tribe, you might have maybe 20 or 30 people. And, there are a lot of studies that say that the human brain can really only deal with connections up to a certain amount of people. I think it's around 120 people it can form strong connections with. Over that amount, the brain just stops kind of making those connections. So small extended family groups, maybe 2 or 3 extended family groups at most, were usual. And within that context, everybody can help each other, and they all rely upon each other. So you kind of get this collectivism within these groups where they share almost everything. They don't really have concepts of wealth, particularly. People have different roles. People might have different kind of possessions and things that belong to themselves, but they wouldn't particularly see them the same way that we do, in the fact that they wouldn't think that they would need to accumulate things or accumulate wealth. In a hunter-gatherer tribe where you don't have even particularly domesticated animals, then you don't really need anything other than yourselves. And in a pastoral community, wealth could be seen through the number of animals that you own, but again, it tends to be more collective. Everybody helps themselves and helps out others. Whereas when you get into a larger group and a settled group, because you're settled down, you can accumulate things in one place. Those with more things tend to have more control over the others. And soon you're going to have to start to organize people. And the way you do that can be through religion. And this is where you start to see religion becomes an aspect of controlling people. Now, shamanism really isn't a religion. It doesn't have a book. It doesn't have anything that's written down that has rules to follow. The difference as well is that if you look at, particularly historically, where religion spread out from, and if you mapped those things out, you could see on a map that certain religions would start in a certain place and spread outwards. And this is because the ideas of that religion have come from a certain person or group of people, and then they've spread out. So you'd see things like, Christianity starting off in around the Middle East and Eastern Europe in Rome. That would spread out across Europe, and you might get Buddhism and Hinduism spreading out from India. You might get Islam spreading through North Africa, and so on. So you get these like spreading blobs of religion because they're moving out from one place. If you did the same thing and tried to map where shamanism was, you just find lots of little dots everywhere. Of course, those religions have kind of wiped out a lot of shamanism in certain places. So in Europe, especially Western Europe, you will find like very little shamanism now. But if you went back far enough in the past, I am sure you would find dots of shamanism spotted everywhere. And this is because shamanism doesn't spread from an idea. Shamanism arises from observation of nature, from learning from nature. So civilizations started to create religions, and those religions were probably, again, actually created by the shamans or people who were using shamanic technique. And this is when shamanism begins to degenerate, because over time that shamanic technique tends to disappear, and the rituals and paraphernalia and so on that was used within that shamanic technique may still continue. So you end up getting a ritual that's empty. People doing certain movements or saying certain things or pretending to do things, but the essence is gone. That shamanic aspect of it is gone. And you can see that very clearly in certain more recent examples. So one example that I've been involved in the past for quite a long time was a tradition that came down from a Japanese shamaness called Nakayama Miki. Now, there's a number of traditions in there, but the largest of those is a group called Tenrikyo. Tenrikyo would classify itself as a religion. They have in the past had lots of shamanic technique within that tradition, but most of it now is gone. And this is an example of that over time. Civilized societies, the esoteric aspects, the underlying shamanic aspects of things can degenerate until it becomes exoteric. So the things that are generally more spiritual and practical based become more performative and ritualized over time. So Tenrikyo is one example of that. And there's nothing particularly wrong with these things, this exotericizing of things, but it loses that essence. But exoteric traditions can help people as well. We of course, are focused more on the esoteric and how that connects in and helps us in certain ways. But rather than think of it as a religion, I like to think of it as a tool. So shamanism is something that you do. It's an art or a tool or a technique that you can practice, and that provides you with a way to get more information that then can help you. It's not a set of rules. It's not a way of living. It's not belief in anything. The only really thing it is connection with nature. So the shaman really, really, really tries to become 100% connected with nature. And that is where we're coming from, really, is that when you're using shamanic technique, you're trying to connect with nature. That connection with nature is going to give you insights into the things around you. That could be the environment, it could be other people, it could be an opponent in terms of martial arts. You're going to get feedback in a non-ordinary way. Non-ordinary, I'm meaning that usually we think of things in a logical kind of order. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. Moving from A to B. These kind of thought processes. We're gonna look at, or we're gonna talk a little bit about this now. The kind of state of mind or non-ordinary state that we need to go into. But I'm just going to go back a second because I just forgot to say something. If we just go back to the understanding of how civilization degrades shamanism. So the reason that civilization begins to degrade shamanism really is that we put up barriers. We put up barriers between ourselves and the environment and reality and nature. All these things. So if you think of that nature is reality, a baseline level of reality that everybody has in common, this whole universe, everything is connected, and therefore that is the reality. Now, as human beings, we also have the ability to use our imagination, and we can create in our imagination perceptions of reality that are not true. And if you look at wild animals, if a wild animal was to create a perception of reality that is not true, then potentially they could die. So a very silly example would be if a zebra believed that the lion was its friend, then it decides it's gonna go and play with the lion, and the lion's hungry, and its normal nature is that it's going to kill the zebra, so the zebra gets killed. So the zebra, if it's got a true perception of reality, it should be, that lion's not a very nice thing for me to be around, I better keep away from it. If it decides to see things differently, then the consequences can be dire. For human beings, however, for most of the time, because we've built up things around us that protect us, we can avoid those dire consequences. If we misunderstand or misperceive what's real, quite often, especially in the modern days, the worst that can happen to us is that we're going to get embarrassed in some way. There are still examples where, extreme examples where we could get harmed. For example, if I decided that I'm fast enough to get across the road before the bus crosses my path, but in reality that's not true, then I could get hit by a bus and I could be killed or injured. But for the most part, it's not gonna have a big impact upon us. But these barriers that we've created, they could be physical barriers, but quite often the rules, the regulations, the misunderstandings, the misperceptions, these things could be written down in history. They could be cultural baggage. They could be aspects of language that make it difficult to see or understand reality properly. And these things, these barriers, these come up in a lot of traditions, in a lot of religions, especially in the Eastern traditions. And there are a lot of words for them. Civilization tends to heap more and more of this stuff onto us. These things that keep us from being part of nature. And because there wasn't really an English term for this, we just came up with a term. We made this term up and we called it the miasma. In the tradition of Nakayama Miki, they call it hokori. And hokori means like a dust. And in that tradition, you could see yourself or your spirit, the essence of yourself, as being like a mirror. And over time, different aspects of dust kind of settle on the mirror. And imagine that over time, the dust gets thicker and thicker. And your spirit is trying to mirror nature. So you and nature are reflecting the same thing. So essentially, you're both the same thing. But over time, that dust is going to obscure that image to the point that it becomes blurred and difficult to see, and then maybe becomes even more tarnished to the point where nature can't even be seen in your spirit anymore. You're just a glimmer of it. And what the tradition teaches you is that you have to constantly sweep away that dust. You've got to constantly clean that mirror. Keep breaking those barriers down. And the more you do that, the more you're going to reflect nature, the more you're going to be connected to nature. I really like that analogy. That's something that through training martial arts, you are helping to break down those barriers. You're helping to break down the miasma and sweep away the dust. So the miasma was this term, and there are lots of aspects of the miasma. We'll go into those as we go along through the podcast, through episodes. We'll find things, examples of what miasma is. But really, they can be belief systems and misconceptions and misperceptions and so on. So that's the miasma. Miasma is going to be a big thing because it's going to be the thing that we're going to try and get rid of so that we can really see what we're doing in the martial arts as well. Because if in the martial arts I believe that I can dodge somebody's strike, but in reality I can't, then I'm going to get hit and I'm going to get hurt. So I need to get rid of those beliefs that are negative to my practice. Okay, so that's miasma. The next thing is that in shamanism, the shaman wants to get rid of this ordinary way of thinking, because this ordinary way of thinking often leads to building up aspects of the miasma. And you can understand that as categorization, categorical thinking, judgments. Making judgments, making assumptions often leads to misrepresenting nature. The only way that we can not misrepresent nature is just to accept it as it is. And in order to accept nature as it is, we need to turn off that rational thinking filter within ourselves. And this is going to be very difficult for everyone to do this at first, if you have been brought up in a civilized Western culture, particularly, but any civilized culture, you're going to find it difficult to turn off judgments, thinking, categorization. And this state that we are talking about, we call this chelicity. And we're going to go into what chelicity really is in the next episode, and how it can benefit us in the martial arts, and how we can go about starting to train how to use chelicity. So chelicity essentially is this non-ordinary state. You don't need to take any drugs to get into it. You don't need to bang a drum to get into it or anything like that, although that can be one way that can help you get into it. But you just need to stop thinking. And once you stop thinking, you start to see things as they are, because you stop making judgments. So that's what we're looking for. Get into that kind of state of being. Once we're in that state of being, then we can really start to practice shamanism. We can start to do things and analyze them by experiencing them. And that experience is not going to be colored by judgment. And that's when we start to get these insights. Now, some of this stuff, when we get into it, is going to seem really simple. And a lot of people, you're going to be thinking, and this is the same when people come to the martial arts. I want to do some shamanism. I want to go on a weird psychedelic journey. I want to meet spirit animals and wizards and aliens and interdimensional beings and all that stuff. And that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is you're going to end up standing on top of a rock somewhere, looking into the distance and thinking, crap, I'm still thinking. Crap, I'm still thinking. So some of you, and then eventually, maybe you're going to start to fall into the chelicity state, and you won't think anything for a while. And then you'll think, wow, I just did it. And at that point where you think, wow, I just did it, you're no longer doing it because you've just thought something. It's going to be very frustrating. So don't expect big things immediately. It's like when people come to the martial arts, they expect that they're going to be able to do a tornado kick straight away, or that they're just going to touch someone and they're going to fall to the floor, or that they're not, they'll be able to just defeat anybody or block every punch, or just be able to evade someone within moments of training, when really this stuff takes many, many years to really get good at. Some of these things you'll be able to pick up quickly, but to integrate everything together is going to take time. And that's the same in martial arts as it is in shamanism. And then trying to combine the two as well is going to be extra. There's going to be extra stuff in there. But I see my shamanic training as part of my martial training rather than as two different things. So the more you train your martial art, if you're doing it with that shamanic technique in mind, you'll be doing both of those things anyway. And over time, things are going to slot into place. Okay, so I think that's a good overview of what shamanism kind of is from our point of view. I should also just briefly touch upon what it's not, because there are lots of things out there that, you know, people misrepresent what shamanism is. Now, a lot of the time, shaman, whatever you want to call them, they're also equated with lots of different roles. Sometimes they're seen as witch doctors, medicine men, healers, prophets, priests, sorcerers and magicians, all this kind of stuff. Psychopomps. A psychopomp is someone that helps people traverse from this life into the next. They're kind of like a person that helps someone get to the afterlife. So there's all these different roles that shaman can take on. But there's a perception that these things, like magician, does something supernatural. Really, almost everything that a shaman can do or does do can be explained using scientific terms or in a scientific kind of way. Sometimes that's going to lose some of the allure to it. But a shaman, just as a martial artist, cannot break the laws of physics. In many ways, what the shaman is trying to do is understand the laws of physics. Those laws of physics are the laws that create the patterns in nature around us. So you can't, you know, a shaman cannot actually fly, although in a shamanic journey, in a shamanic state, there may be a perception of flying. It's not something that we're particularly going to be looking for in the martial arts, though, because we want to be grounded in the physical. But there are things like that. A shaman doesn't literally fly. It doesn't literally talk with astral beings and so on. They're pulling out information patterns from nature. So, and we'll get into some of this stuff further as we go along. But something like spirit animals, they're very different to what people would actually think of them. So one of the things is a lot of New Age people, groups, they're appropriating the term shamanism or shamanic. So a lot of these things, they have shamanic ceremonies and they do shamanic journeys. And a lot of the time this is all imagination based. So if someone is trying to do some kind of a guided meditation, let's say, it might involve drums, it might not. Quite often they do. So it might be listen to the drum or whatever it might be, count down from 10. Imagine that you're going down some stairs or into a hole sometimes or through a door. And as you pass through that portal, you're going to be somewhere different. And they would say that this is a shamanic journey. And on that journey, they might meet with an animal or a spirit or a being. And then they will have like a literal conversation with that being and they'll bring back some information from them. Now, that's not reality. That's imagination. If you're not disciplined, then your brain's going to give you lots of this stuff. Your brain's great at misrepresenting things, taking shortcuts. This is why we have things like optical illusions, because our brains short circuit. And it's not really that you're seeing an animal and having a conversation with them if you're doing real shamanic technique. But it's so difficult to explain some of these things using words, using language, that when you describe them back to someone who has not been part of that experience, you try to find ways to connect with them. to give them an understanding of what it is you've experienced. And quite often you use those things that are most familiar. So in tribal societies, hunter-gatherer societies, there would be things like animals and trees and so on. And they did believe in, or they understood, that everything has a different character or a different spirit to itself, an essence. So they would talk about those things. And then over time, those things have been misrepresented. So now we see them as more supernatural type things. So that's one aspect, that shamanism is not imaginary. It's real. You're doing real things and you're getting real feedback, and then you get real experience. And that real experience helps you in the future. Another thing is that shamanism does not need to involve drugs or plant medicine or catalyst or whatever you want to call it. Anything that might put you into an altered state. Sometimes these things can be used by shamans, but I actually read a scientific paper recently that said that a lot of the early research on shamans overrepresented or overestimated the use of psychedelic or psychotropic substances, and that quite often the shamans avoid these things because they're trying to do a technique. That substance can sometimes help you get to that point of being able to use that technique faster. But if you're able to do it without the substance, you're seen as being more competent or stronger. So a lot of shamans avoid these things. So you don't need to do those things. You don't need to take ayahuasca or peyote or do some mushrooms in order to get into a shamanic state. It's unnecessary. The other thing is that quite often, especially again in these new age groups, shamanism or shamanic ceremonies or whatever it is that they're doing are seen as something to help them heal or something to make them feel good. A shaman does not always do what they do to feel good. There are lots of examples of shamanic technique which are not particularly good for the shaman. The shaman was someone who was an experimenter. So a shaman might have been the person that found a new kind of mushroom, let's say, and decides, well, I'm going to take a little tiny nibble of that just to see if I can eat it. And maybe that's going to make them feel sick. And to them, that's good experience, good shamanic experience. It's not going to feel good. It's not going to be nice for them, but it's good shamanic experience. When you get hit in your martial arts practice, it doesn't feel good, but you learn from it. So when we're practicing shamanism, we're going to put ourselves quite often into uncomfortable situations that may have an aspect of jeopardy, potential pain, potential injury, and we're going to try and learn from that and get experience from that. That's not something that's particularly nice. So sometimes the shaman puts themselves in bad places. Also, sometimes shamanic technique can be stressful. If done wrong, it can be difficult to see those differences in perception of reality. And you can get instances where people start to have mental health issues from doing these practices, because they start to misunderstand or misrepresent aspects of what's real and what's not real. And sometimes people find it very difficult to put themselves under that kind of pressure as well. The training can have a lot of pressure. It can be very difficult. It can be very boring. It can be very frustrating. So it's not necessarily going to give immediate results. and it's not necessarily going to make people feel good. So if you see people or hear people that are doing shamanic practice, and let's say they've been doing it for a very short amount of time, but they're telling you that they're going on shamanic journeys and so on, that's probably a load of crap, because it can take years and years and years to get there. Okay, we're at 50 minutes. It's a long one. I'm just going to go through something else very quickly. So in terms of shamanic training, quite often different traditions have different ways of seeing it, but usually it's ways of breaking down that miasma. And the more you can break it down, the more connection you get with nature. The traditions that I've been most connected to, the training that I've done, usually looks at breaking this down into 7 different aspects. Sometimes we call these 7 levels, but really they're all different ways of using of trying to achieve the same thing through different technique. And you're building up until you can really connect 100% with your environment. I'll just quickly go through those 7 different aspects. The first level is Chillicity. We've talked about this very briefly. If you can't do Chillicity, you're not going to be able to do the rest of it. Chillicity is the state of being, this changed state of consciousness that you need to be in. You need that. You could practice techniques at higher levels, but if you're not in that state of Chillicity when you're doing that, you're not going to get the full potential. You're not going to get the full understanding from that. So Chillicity is the first stage. I'm going to use terms that we made up. These terms, by the way, or I'm going to use English terms. These terms, by the way, were words that we worked a long time over. We used to meet before martial arts practice on weekends in a cafe, and there'd be a group of us, myself, my guide Damon, in later years Joe, who runs the Woven Energy podcast with Damon. Joe would be part of that as well, but there'd be other guys around, guys like my friend Alex, who's a police officer, our good friend John, who's been around a long time, and Dave, a guy I trained a lot with back in those days, and there'd be other people around as well. So we had a good mix of different people, different backgrounds, and we would chat and talk about all these things. And we decided that one of the things that holds us back is that we didn't have this language that we could use very easily. We were using at the time Japanese terms, sometimes Chinese, and now Damon, I know, uses the Mongol terms a lot in his podcast. But these terms we found were difficult for us to hold on to and remember and understand. So we tried to create English equivalents. Our idea was if we used terms that were either archaic, old terms that had some meaning already but weren't in modern usage, then these would be helpful. Or we would make terms up completely, because we didn't want to be using many terms that already had cultural baggage from English and therefore from predominantly Christian culture. So Chillicity is this altered state of mind, and it represents the chalice, or a cup, that's got a cup, a connection point, and a base, a supporting base. So that's the state of mind you need to get into, a state of being you need to get into in order to then do the rest of the practice. Without that, the rest of the practice is reduced. Second level, sometimes called the breath, but I like to just call it energy work or energy. And it's about understanding energy and structure within yourself. So we'll start from inside and work outwards. So we're looking at ourselves and the energy and things that we can do with it. The third aspect is movement or technique. You start to learn techniques that energy that you've become aware of, you start to apply it. And now you're applying it through movement and through creation of movement. So that could be through sound, it could be through art, it could be through dance or physical movement. But you start to do technique. Then the next level 4 would be weave or weaving. So you're starting to connect things together. So your technique is not isolated. It can be connected to another technique, and then another technique, and then another technique, as many as you want. So you're weaving those things together, and you're doing that in a specific way so as to keep a thread of intention through those things. Level 5 is intersecting. So if you think that you're creating a pattern or a weave, nature's already got a pattern or weave. Things are changing and moving in nature already. And what you're trying to do is kind of intersect with nature. And at first you might overlap a little bit, but over time you're going to learn to do that more and more. So if you imagine you were doing some martial arts practice or something, or dancing around and moving around, and there's a camera that's really high above you, like on a drone or from a satellite, but it can see you doing that. And that camera is also creating a trail behind you where you've been. You will be tracing out a pattern of where you've been. And if then there was some way to overlay or show patterns that are being created in movement in nature, it could be like the direction of the wind or where the wind's moving. If you were able to draw that pattern, then what you would find is probably that most people's patterns are completely different to that of the pattern around them in nature. But the more that you can kind of get those patterns to match up, the more you connect with nature. And that's that aspect. You're trying to learn how you can become more like nature through your technique and intersecting with the weave of nature. 6 is journey. So this is like a spirit journey. This is where you become so connected to that weave with nature that you start to see things within it, and that is able to, or you start to feel things within it. And then you get some insight from nature, and you can bring that insight back, and that can help you in various ways. There's different ways in which the journey can manifest itself. And to tell you the truth, most of what we're going to do in martial arts is going to be related to the first 5 levels, and then the level 6, the journey, and the next one. They're kind of high. They're more abstract things that are usually used in more pure shamanism, and they're things that could be used for bigger picture things, like what's going on in your life or the lives of people around you. Sometimes they're predictive, sometimes they give insight. And you can then use that to help you in general. Martial arts and martial arts practice are generally more immediate. So we're not kind of thinking more about the strategic, what's going to happen in 5 years' time. We're thinking about how do we not get hit by this guy who's trying to hit me right now. So we're more concerned with those first 5. So level 6, where it's concerned with this journey or spirit journey, that's something that martial arts practice can get you towards and help you with it. Shamanic martial arts practice, I should say that. But it's not something that we're particularly focused upon. And I have to say that it's very difficult to discern for me, like whether or not I've even done a full, proper spirit journey, even after years of training. I think that, I'm pretty good at times. I'm pretty good at the first 4 levels. Sometimes level 5, maybe I can feel that too. Level 6 is still kind of elusive to me. And then level 7 is like becoming one with nature. And that sounds really strange. It's like a really high level, but that's essentially what it is. And from my understanding of that, you become so connected with nature that while you're in that, you get a lot of insight and a lot of feeling, and you can drop out of these non-ordinary states and go back into your normal state. Usually, when you go back into your normal state, there's a big change or big difference. You know the difference between your normal state and the non-ordinary state. But apparently, the more you can connect to that level 7, the more you do that, the more it starts to come back to you. When you're in you bring things back, and they hang around with you. These feelings and ways of being, it starts to influence your normal state of being as well. So they're the 7 levels. We're just over an hour now. I've talked a lot about shamanism. A lot of that is just the surface level, especially those seven levels. You'll find a lot more information about Chalicity and about those 7 levels in Damon and Joe's podcast, the Woven Energy podcast on practical shamanism. I suggest you go and listen to some of those. I think they've got about 60 episodes now, and the ones that you're going to be concerned with are really going to be the ones near the beginning. So I think the Chalicity episodes are around about episode 6 or 7. I think there's 3 of them, and they talk about the levels, different levels of shamanic training throughout. So it's probably a good place to listen to the first maybe 10 episodes or so. I'm going to give you a lot of information, a lot of technique that's going to overlap with what I'm talking about as well. So hopefully we're all on the same page, and next time I can start to talk about Chalicity, this like chalice-like or cup-like nature. Some people might be able to relate to it. It's got certain aspects that are similar to some forms of meditation, but we'll talk about that more in depth in the next episode. So thanks guys. I will see you later in episode 3.